With acrylic paints, we usually paint back to front, meaning the things that are farthest away from us first, and then we paint the things that are closer to us. So I'm going to start off by painting the night sky. I'm going to use the large flat brush for this, and I'm going to dip it in water and get the excess drips off on the cup. And then I dip it in the blue paint and brush left to right strokes across the top half of the canvas. Now you don't need to go all the way to the edges because the edges will be covered up by the keyhole. You don't have to use left to right strokes. You could use crisscross strokes or circular strokes to create more of a cloudy, dramatic effect if you'd like. Now that I've made it about halfway down, I'm going to mix some teal in there. There's no need to clean off the brush before you load the teal because we want these colors to mix together. We're going to make a transition from dark blue to teal, and in the middle we want to have a mixture between blue and teal. The top will be dark blue, the middle will be blue with teal, and the bottom will be just teal. Notice that with water on my brush, these paints are flowing across the canvas very nicely. If they're not flowing across the canvas nicely, like this, then it means you need a little bit more water on your brush. If they're flowing too well and very drippy and also very transparent, then it means you need less water and more paint. Now, if you want to add a second layer of dark blue to make the sky darker, you can. And that's what I do here. But the important thing is to let the first layer dry before you apply the second. I like to use a hairdryer to make the drying process a lot faster. Now on to my favorite part, which is the stars. The stars are really fun to make because you get to do splatter art. So I grab my plate and some white paint, and I use some water to create a puddle of white paint. We want it to be wet enough that when we splatter it, it comes off the brush, but not so wet that you can't see the stars or that it creates really big drips. Now I load the brush with a little bit of paint and start with just a few stars. I tap my finger to create these splattery stars. Don't load the brush too much, otherwise you might get really big blobs. If the paint doesn't come off the brush, then you can go ahead and load it with more paint. You can also pull the bristles back with your finger and flick them onto the canvas. Just be careful though, because this can sometimes cause shooting stars, which can be a really cool thing and sometimes can turn into a happy accident. But sometimes it can turn into just an accident, so be careful. If you'd like, you can even practice on a separate piece of paper until you feel comfortable with the technique and you feel like your paint mixture is the right consistency. If you have a star that you don't like, then you can rub it off gently with a wet paper towel while the paint is still wet. However, once acrylic paints dry, they become water resistant, and so water won't really help. If the paint dries before you can clean up a star that you don't want, you might need to paint over it with the original colors, like the dark blue or the teal, and then apply your stars again, as long as the layer underneath is dry. Now that I'm done with the stars, I'm cleaning my plate to get any wet paint off of it, because I'm actually going to place it on the canvas and trace around it with chalk to create a circle. Now I grab my chalk, and on a separate piece of paper, I'm trying to give the chalk a little bit of a point. As you see here, my chalk is a little bit more pointy, which allows me to trace a little bit easier. When I started to trace the plate, I realized that tracing it face down made a circle that was too big, and tracing it face up made a circle that was too small. So I decided to cut around the rim of the plate, and this made a circle that was not too big, not too small, just right. I erased my original circle with a little bit of water on a clean brush, and now I place it on the canvas and make sure that it's centered, that we have the same distance on the left as on the right. I also want it to be about an inch down from the top of the canvas. Now the circle might not be perfect, and that's totally okay. I'm going to make a little bit of adjustments to make it a little bit more round. Now for this next part of the keyhole, we want to create an angle that comes down on the left and on the right side. But instead of just placing it anywhere, I'm going to give myself a guide. So I'm going to hold the brush straight up and down, going to create a dot that lines up with the left side of my circle. It should be about an inch from the bottom of the canvas. Now I create a dot on the opposite side. Again, a dot that lines up with the right side of the circle and is about an inch from the bottom of the canvas. Now I'm going to angle my brush and create a line that connects from the edge of the circle to the dot that I made. You can use the brush as a straight edge. Now I'm going to create one on the opposite side. The thing is, I notice that the line on the left side is a little bit more slanted inward than the one on the right, and I like the one on the right better. So I'm going to redraw the line on the left to better mirror the one on the right, and then I can erase the line that I don't want with a tiny bit of water on a clean brush. Now I can connect these two slanted lines with a horizontal line that goes across the bottom. Now I've got the drawing for the keyhole. The next thing we need to do is erase the part of the circle that is within the keyhole, because we don't need that. And now I can clean up any edges that I want to clean up while I have some water on that brush. The next thing we're going to do is paint pine trees. Now let me show you an easy way to make pine trees. I take a small brush, either the pointed brush or the small filbert brush, a little bit of water, and some black paint. I create a vertical line starting at the top and going downward. The key here is to use very, very light pressure. If you press down hard, you'll get a thick line like this. So remember, light pressure, and you'll be able to control your lines. This is an important thing to remember whenever you do a painting of anything. Your lines can often be controlled by the amount of pressure you apply. I switched to the small filbert brush because I like painting trees with that brush better than the pointed one. Now here is an example of a pine tree, and I'll show you how I created that. So I create my vertical line and leave a little bit of the point at the very top blank. I don't want to start my tree branches right at the very top. I want to start them a little bit below the top of the tree. And with very little pressure, create little tiny marks on either side of the vertical line, which obviously represents the trunk. And I go back and forth creating the tree branches, making each branch as I go down a little bit longer on the left and on the right. This helps us get a tree that looks like a cone. What we really want to avoid here is, again, remember, thick strokes, and we want to avoid really unnatural looking trees like these. One would be the straight lines or very, very separated branches. Another one would be the arrow tree that looks like a bunch of arrows pointing up. Another one would be the tree that has so many branches so close together that it just looks like a blob. And another one is with no cone shape to it at all. So remember, it's so important. We want these trees to look like a cone. It should be a triangular shape where the branches at the top are always skinnier than the branches on the bottom. They progressively get longer on the left and right sides as you go down. Now I'm going to practice more trees, and there are some other things you want to keep in mind when you're doing trees. It's great to have a variety of sizes. You want to have some trees that are big, some that are small, and some that are in between. We also want variety in the distance between each of the trees. Some should be closer together than others, and some should be farther apart than others. This will help it look organic and natural. One more thing. You can paint a very skinny tree like this and still get the cone shape, or you can paint a tree like this that's very wide and you still have the cone shape, which is great. Either one looks good, but I typically like to paint something that's in between. Alright, now that we've practiced on a separate piece of paper, we can get started painting the trees on our canvas. After I load the brush with paint, I dab it a little bit on a paper towel or on a plate to get the excess paint off of the brush, and also to flatten out the bristles so that I can have complete control over the line that I make and get a nice thin trunk for my tree. So now I create the vertical line, and a little ways down from the top of the tree, I start my branches. This gives it that nice point at the top, and then I do exactly what I practiced on my scrap piece of paper. Remember, some big, some small. Don't be afraid to make some really big and some really small. This gives it depth and extra interest. Now with the black paint and the same brush, I carefully outline the entire keyhole with black. Once I've done that, I can clean off my brush, and then using the large flat brush or the large filbert brush, I can fill in the entire space around the keyhole with black. Now I need to let this dry. It should only take about 3 to 5 minutes. Again, you can always use a hairdryer to make the drying process go faster. If you don't have a hairdryer, you can always use a big piece of paper or a disposable plate to fan it off. We want to create an old rusty bronze sort of texture, so we are going to apply a few layers of different colors to achieve this. Now that it's dry, I'm going to open up the dark brown paint, and using my large filbert brush, I'm going to apply this brown paint to the canvas. I don't want big blobs of brown paint on my canvas like this. What I want to do is get the excess paint off on my plate before I apply it to my painting. This allows me to have more control over my strokes. The idea here is to create kind of a cloudy effect on top of the black. We do this by using tiny little circular strokes and gently rubbing it into the canvas. And we don't want to completely cover the black with this brown color. We just want to put it on top and let some of the black show through in some places. Again, it's kind of a cloudy effect with circular strokes. I'm applying this technique to the entire canvas around the keyhole. After I'm done, I notice that I want to make it a little bit darker on the corners so that it pulls our focus into the middle. So I put a little bit of black back into the corners and onto the sides of the canvas using the same cloudy technique. Now I'm opening up the reddish brown color. This is called burnt sienna, and this is going to help us get more of a rusty look. And I'm applying it to the canvas with the same technique that I used for the dark brown. Remember, you want the color underneath to still show through a bit, so don't completely cover the canvas with this reddish brown color. Let some of the black spots and some of the dark brown spots show through. If you cover the canvas too much with a certain color, you can always go through and add more of another color on top. In this case, I'm adding a little bit more black and a little bit more dark brown to help break things up so it doesn't look flat and to give it more of a rough old texture. A little bit of water is going to be your friend during this process because it will help things blend into each other. Remember to not have big blobs of paint on your brush. Load the brush with very little paint each time so that you don't get spots that are really heavy. It makes it much easier to blend when you use just a little bit of paint at a time. Once I'm done with that, I grab some white paint and the two browns. I'm going to create a color that's a little bit lighter than the other colors that I've been using. I'm going to apply this more sparingly than the other colors. You can also use your finger and pat certain spots that are too strong to soften them up and to help them blend in. Now with a tiny bit of black, I'm going to make sure I have a shadow on the top edge of the keyhole. This part is facing away from the light, so it will be dark. I also add a little bit of black to the sides of the keyhole. These lines do not need to be very thick. With my chalk, I create two circles. These will represent bolts next to the keyhole. Each circle should be about an inch or an inch and a half round, and both should be the same distance apart from the sides of the canvas, and also the same distance apart from the edges of the keyhole. Once I've drawn those out, I fill them in completely with black. I'm going to apply more paint to these bolts, but first I need to let this black layer dry. Now that they're dry, before I go on to the next step, I can wipe off any remaining chalk. Now I can apply the dark brown to the circle, but I want to leave the outside edges of the circle black, especially the bottom left of the circle. We're going to say that light is hitting these bolts from the top right. So we are going to apply this dark brown color to most of the circle, but we're going to leave the bottom left side a little bit dark. That's the shadow side. If you cover up too much of the bolt with brown, you can always apply more black on top, which is what I'm doing here. Once that's dry, I can start to add a little bit of burnt sienna on top. I'm doing this with little dabbing motions. This again gives it a little bit of texture and lets some of that dark brown still show through underneath. Remember to keep those left sides dark, so touch them up as you go if you need to. Preserving that shadow will help you get a more three-dimensional look. Now I'm going to mix a highlight color. To do this, I get some white, the tiniest touch of black to make a gray, and then to my gray I add some of the dark brown and some of the reddish brown. Now I'm adding this color to the top right of the circle because the light is coming from the top right. Now you can start to see how these bolts are looking more three-dimensional. If you get a spot you don't like, you can always cover it up with another color. In this case, I'll cover up this little spot that I don't want with black. Now, again with my highlight color, I'm going to create a line across the bottom, showing that light is hitting that area. I apply that same color to the sides of the keyhole, and also to the bottom side of the circle, on the left and on the right. Now I'm going to mix a new highlight color that's just a little bit brighter than the last. I do that by simply adding more white. Now this highlight color should still be a tan rather than a perfect white. Now I create a circle on the top right of the bolt. I'm going to switch to the pointed brush because it's easier to paint a small circle that way. Now I'm going to apply this brighter highlight color to the bottom of the keyhole and to the bottom portion of the circle on the left and on the right, but not to the angled sides of the keyhole. Now, the last finishing touch I'm going to add is just a little bit of burnt sienna, that warm brown color, right underneath the bolts, as if there's a little bit more rust right underneath the bolts. Now I make any other small adjustment that I want to make to my painting, and then it's finished. Don't forget to sign your painting. Now we have a beautiful keyhole looking out into the night sky.